Going to work, please? Yeah, great, thank you. There's evidently a 6-second delay, I've been told, from a video to the microphone, so that proves it's true. Look, I mean, yesterday at the session, for those, a lot of you who attended, you know, the bit I find most fascinating is the unconscious biases, because it's like we're all subject to them, and until we raise our consciousness and awareness, we're always going to be subject to them, and we'll never change them. So, and how to do that is complex and subtle, and most people actually want to stay as they are because they think it's fine as it is. So it's such an important subject, which is why I'm really pleased we got time to go through it here. Now, again, I don't want to, some of you weren't here, but a lot of you were, so I don't want to for us just to repeat what we did yesterday, because one of the things yesterday was about, you know, understanding unconscious biases. I think we've done enough of that to understand what it is. So what I want to really focus on is what we do about it. So how do we measure it? How do we act on it? How do we know if it's changing? All that sort of stuff. So I want to start with you, Nathalie. You're the CEO of Diverseo. Can you just, how do we know, you know, it's such a difficult thing is that we don't know if we're being unconscious because it's unconscious. How do we actually find out? So if you're a company, how do you actually go through the process of knowing what the problem is? Can you measure it? Just give us a sort of feeling for, okay, we know there's a problem, we want to do something about it, what happens?
It is actually a very complex question, because when you deal with large organizations, actually you need to use business tools and to come back to reality. I remember once I had one of my first conversations with the CEO of a very large industrial company. His head of HR told him that he should sit down with me to talk about unconscious bias, and his initial reaction was, but I'm not going to take my employees into fMRIs to understand how their brain works. It's impossible, right? So what we have designed, and at Diverseo we worked extensively with researchers such as Nathalie Malige from Harvard University, was to try to create and find out scientifically grounded tools that were effective for business. And so one of the first things that we designed was awareness sessions where people could actually experience the impacts of the automatic workings of the minds, using cognitive illusions, but also using implicit association tests. So for those of you who are not yet familiar with such tests, these are test algorithms which are web-based, where you can actually experience how easy or how difficult it is to associate some concepts or some dimensions together. So that's one of the first steps to do. Then, when you're speaking about large organizations, well, people love numbers. And actually, by using the newest techniques with data analysis, you can actually just see very well the impact of the unconscious bias on the composition of the workforce, but also more and more now on the impact of the bias in the business performance. I could speak about this for a long time, so I'm going to give you just a couple of examples. When we start a transformation program with clients, we usually download much as possible all their HR data. And we analyze the data looking at the long term and looking at the long-term impact of various data, various information that we can have. And one of the first things that happens usually when the clients see the results is that they have a feeling that they didn't know what was going on in their companies. There is quite often a feeling of complete disbelief of what was happening in their organization. For example, quite often people think that women leave, and this is one of the reasons why there are no women at the top. Very often we see that they're just not getting promoted. Very often people have this feeling that it's so difficult to get women in senior positions, especially at the age where they might have children, where actually when you look at the number of maternity leaves in a company, it's just so much less than other reasons for which people might get, for example, sick or whatever. So just getting the data and getting things right very often completely changes the way people look at women and women's performance. Then we have new tools that we can use today. For example, we invented interviewing techniques when we can actually surface all the biases that are creeping in corporate culture. And here it's very interesting and fascinating. For example, we've seen in very large multinational companies that when we interview people, we just hear the same type of biases creeping up, whether we were interviewing somebody in South Africa, somebody in the UK, somebody in the US, somebody in China. These are very deeply rooted mental mechanisms that apply almost the same everywhere. The difference that we see is that there is a difference in their intensity from one country to another. And what we see also is that there is a very strong difference in their nature from one company to another, including in the same industry. So being able to surface them is really important, because if you don't tackle the right unconscious bias, you just waste a lot of money and a lot of resources. And to do that, once you have a list of all, I would say, qualitative bias, and very often we have tons of them, then what we do is that we use implicit association tests, quite often customized tests, to know which are the biases that are the strongest in the organization. And that has a twofold impact. One is when people actually take these tests, they become aware of those biases, and instinctively, and this is something important, instinctively becoming aware, we know that there is a very high proportion of people who are instinctively going to correct sort of their behaviors, because very often these unconscious behaviors are not aligned with their explicit beliefs and their explicit values. And also, once we get the data, we're much more effective at understanding what we need to tackle. The last point is the external impact, and this is where it's much easier to get, I would say, the dollars. We've been working with researchers to try to understand the impact of unconscious bias on individual performance. When we look at internal performance, it's very complex, because the performance of a team in a business is linked to so many different aspects that it's difficult to isolate the impact of the bias from others. It can technically be done, but it requires a lot of data, and especially clean HR data, which is a bit more difficult to obtain quite often. But there are some research that shows that the impact of unconscious or conscious stereotype is at least 20% on someone's performance on a very measurable task. And in business, when you look at how business operates and all the cost-cutting plans and so on and so forth, just think about what would represent a 20% bottom line impact. It's huge money. It's absolutely huge money. That's internal. Externally, we've done some mock shopping. We looked at quantitative data in different industries, and whether we look at B2C businesses such as telecom companies, banks, consumer goods, whatever, when we measure the impact, it's just usually amazingly high. But also in B2B, more and more now, you have women who have senior positions, and when you have a sales force who's uneasy at interacting with a female senior leader, well, you lose sales. You lose a lot of sales. But just to come back to the B2C aspect, just to give you a very simple example, and I would encourage you to do the same in your organization. In a telecom company, with the telecom sector, we've done some mock shopping. And we invited 3 groups of people to enter a mobile phone store with exactly the same script, asking for exactly the same thing. We had a group of 35-year-old men, what we would call the white guy, entering the store. Usually they would get a very high-scale premium phone in Europe for about 650 euros. Then you have another group that could come in and ask for exactly the same thing, and I'm not going to detail all the groups, but the group of women at the age of having children with exactly the same script would first be offered quite often a sort of family package when they are selling family packages, or then they would be so disregarded by the sales force that quite often, even if they look highly educated and able to pay for a phone, they would end up with a catalog to study so that they would understand which phone they might be operating. And I'm not speaking about something strange or something that doesn't happen quite often. it happens much more often than you think. Banking sector, same thing. You take the numbers, you do the analysis, you just do a fake sale, having one guy entering a banking agency with a credit file for a business, another woman entering the same banking agency with exactly the same file. Guess what? The man has a 30% higher probability of getting the loan than the woman on average. So for business, it means lost sales. And this is ingrained in the culture. This is ingrained in the decision-making processes. So this is a way to measure also the impact of the bias.
Okay, that's very helpful. But the fact is we love our biases because we think they define us. So you know, again, that's the facts. You know, you can lose business, there's a business case, actually. But actually there's something about people, you know, that they want, you know, if someone plays golf with Johnny, they want him to have the job because they like him and they don't want to change. They don't want Susie to come in and work with her because actually they like Johnny. So I'm just saying, so how do we go from an awareness is the first step, but it doesn't necessarily lead to action. And often it leads to regression, that people might see it, but then a day later they're busy and they return exactly to where they wanted to be in the first place. So how do we get from that knowledge, awareness, the business case, to action that is really meaningful?
First of all, for many people, once they get aware of their biases, and when you select the right test for them to become aware of them, many of them actually have a shock. They're not so happy about it because most often, most people believe they need to be fair and objective, and they believe themselves are fair and objective. So once they start to see that actually they're not, quite often it creates a situation where they know they need to act. So that's one first thing. But then to really make sure that we don't always promote people who really look like us, the people that we like, it's actually not straightforward at all. As Pramzile mentioned earlier, this is a very complex problem. And we need to understand that unconscious biases are the results of the automatic workings of the mind. This is how our mind operates. When the first time I met Mahzarin Banaji in 2006, she said, no, we can't fix it. That's the way the mind works. We cannot do anything. Now, since then, we've made a lot of progress to understand that there are things that can be done. In the things that can be done, of course, that there is the awareness piece, which is important. The second piece, which is important on the individual behavioral change, and I'm going to talk quickly about the structural change or the more, I would say, systemic change from an organizational standpoint. But the second point is really to foster individual responsibility to change, because if people are not responsible, they're not going to put the effort. And this is where making sure people are incentivized and making sure that people are being told this is the right thing to do is important. And also making sure that people understand this is the right type of value to have. Is also important, because then once you have this in place, you can start to get people to actually exercise, for example, mental exercises. Cognitive, the science of how the mind operates has made a lot of progress since 2005 with the last generations, for example, of fMRIs. So now we start to understand how to overcome those automatic mental mechanisms with typical exercises that are the results of research in cognitive science. Some are very simple, for example, thinking about the counter-stereotype for a few seconds, and if we do this on a repetitive basis, we know it's going to decrease the impact of the unconscious bias. And I'm not going to detail all of this right now, but there are techniques now we know which are effective. Then the second piece, which is important, is to actually work on the organizational structure, and on the structure and the processes and so on. We need to understand one thing. You cannot overcome or override the workings of your automatic mind. This is the way it is. You have it. We all have it. Now the question is, how do we build decision-making processes that would better allow people to make objective decisions? It's not just by removing the selection process of high potential in a company between the age of 30 and 35, or just making sure that the impact of maternity leave would be more neutralized. It's much deeper. People need to look at the way people actually process information when they use an HR process, and whether those HR processes encourage or discourage inferences, which are sort of systematic mistakes that we do when we actually process information. So it's usually reviewing the process of the structure of the process itself. It's reviewing the criteria and the way people understand them. Very often, we have companies that have so many criteria, up to 10 to 15 competencies, for example. We know that people then will pick what they like. So this is the kind of mechanisms we need to look like. And very often, the devil is in the details. People don't even see the problems anymore. So HR processes are important. Then all the messages that you get when you get into a company are also important. All the small cues. You know, what is the company sponsoring? What is the most important sport that the company is sponsoring, the most important activity? Is it rugby, or is it more gender neutral? When you look at the pictures in internal communication, do you see only men standing and women sitting? Or are, you know, the roles more balanced? When there is a senior executive conference, who's speaking? Do you have only male speakers on stage and the director of communication providing the microphone to them, she being the only female on stage? So these are the small things that people need to become aware of, and these are not easy to change.
Okay,
and training, of course.
Yeah, God, it's complex, it's so complex.